Today we're talking chapter 5 about divine or God's providence. And this is, again, one of the chapters that maybe this is a doctrine that modern evangelical Christians don't think about so much. We don't think in terms of providence, and that's really an unfortunate thing. It's a great loss for us. So what is providence? Well, providence refers to God's superintendence of all things. That as Christians, we look at the world, we say a biblical way of looking at the world is that God is attending to everything. That everything falls under God's providence. Everything that happens, it's God who's in charge. And this is some Christians, we believe in providence, and we say things like, God's in charge all the time. God's in charge of everything. He's the one who's always at work in everything. The idea that God is absolutely in charge of everything, or God's sovereignty, we might say God's providence is his administration of everything. It's what he's actually doing. So we believe God's sovereign, he's in charge of everything. But what we actually see him do, his administration of things, we could call his providence. It comes from the same word as our English word provide. So the word provide has a meaning in English to attend to something, to be the one who takes care of something. So we go around, we say God's taking care of, he's taking care of everything, he's attending to everything in his administration. So we call that God's providence. So everything that happens to us, we can say, it's God's providence. In the providence of God, things happen to me, okay? So let's look at this, paragraph 1. God, the good creator of all things, in his infinite power and wisdom, does uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence. So it gives us some verbs there. God upholds all things. He directs all things. He disposes, or he causes all things to happen, and he governs all things. He exercises control of all things by his most wise and holy providence. Okay, and then the next phrase says, to the end for the which they were created. Okay, so God's providence isn't random. Okay, now when we look at the world, there's a lot about God's providence. There's things that happen to me today that I don't understand. There's things that happen in the world this year that I don't understand. When we talk about God's providence, we're not just saying God's in charge, we're also saying God has a plan and that he's directing all of things to the ends for which they were created. So God created things to happen in a certain way. He's moving everything, we'd use an earlier example that we use, God's landing every plane. He's bringing everything to the end that he created it for. According unto his infallible foreknowledge, it says, and the free and immutable counsel of his own will. Just like we talked about with the chapter on God's decree, God's administration, the things that God chooses to do in the world, he's under no compulsion to do, right? He is always acting freely, according to the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, infinite mercy, infinite goodness, and mercy. So in other words, God is displaying through his administration of all things, through his providential management of all things, or superintendence of all things, God is displaying the glories of his character. Okay, so that's the first paragraph. Paragraph 2. Although in relation to the foreknowledge and decree of God, the first cause, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly. Let's talk about that. He talks about this difference between first causes and second causes, and we talked about this also, I think, in the chapter on God's decree. What does it mean when we say that the decree of God is the first cause? That means if we dig back to the ultimate reason why anything is the way it is, or why anything happens the way it does, we can always say safely, it is because God has willed it to be so, right? It is because God wills. Nothing can happen or could ever happen in the world that was absolutely contrary to the will of God. Now, as we'll see, there's a sense in which we can say God did not will for us to do, or for us to act in such a way. That's true. But everything that happens in the world, if we honestly affirm that God is in control of everything, then we have to say way deep down, though, even things that seem to be bad and seem to be disobedient to God or seem to be rebellious against God, God's always in control, and that means the first cause of everything, the ultimate, you dig all the way down to the very bottom, the first cause of everything is the decree of God. And it says, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly. So God's will does not fail to happen. And immutably, God hasn't changed his plan one time. Has God made one change to his plan since the beginning of the world? No, he has not. All things come to pass without change and without fail, so that there is not anything befalls any by chance or without his providence. So he says, so complete is God's decree. So God's decree covers everything that happens in creation, so much that we can say nothing happens to anybody by chance or outside of his providence. Is there anything that's ever happened to you that happened outside of the providence of God? No. Everything that's ever happened to you and everything you've ever done, anything anyone has ever done, anything that's ever happened in the created universe has happened according to the providence of God as the ultimate, as the base cause of all things. But paragraph 2 has the second half. Yet, okay, so that's not all. It's only part of the picture. Yet, by the same providence, he ordered them to fall out or to happen according to the nature of second causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently. So he's saying that's not the full picture, okay? God's providence did not only decree that such and such things would happen, that these results would happen, but he also decreed that there would be secondary causes, right? That God would not just magically cause the state of affairs to appear, but that it would appear to have, again, from what we can observe in our world, there's a chain of causes. This caused this to happen, and this caused that to happen. I threw the ball, and it broke the window. Did God, in his providence, decree that that window would be broken? Yes. And in his providence, he decreed that I would be the secondary cause, throwing the baseball and breaking the window, right? Now, notice that doesn't say anything at all about what's happening in my will, what my personal state is as I throw. I haven't told you any more about the story. I haven't told you why I would throw a baseball through a window. But the point that the paragraph here is making is that God's providence oversees all of this, and he includes all of these different levels of causation, or these different causes and all the things that are going on. And he mentions 3 kinds of causes that we can observe. And anything that happens, we can say something happens necessarily, freely, or contingently. Necessarily means it just happens as a law. If I jump out this window, I fall. If I throw a baseball hard enough at a window, it's going to break it, right? So that's the baseball isn't, the window isn't choosing anything. The baseball isn't choosing anything. It's just obeying what today we would call the laws of nature. It's happening necessarily, right? Or some things happen freely, meaning I make a choice to do something. And notice the paragraph is pointing out that something happening according to my choice is somehow happening at a different level from God decreeing that something would be happening. So this does not in any way cancel out the idea of people freely exercising their will. We are freely exercising our will, but the point the confession is making is that even when you're freely exercising your will, God is still in control. He is in control of free agents freely doing the free things that they want to do, right? Pile all the freedom that you want on, it doesn't cancel out God, because he's superintending the entire chain of events. And the third thing it says is contingently. Contingently, the third way, so things can happen necessarily, just as a law, without anything choosing anything. Happen freely, there's an element of someone's choosing something in there. And third, it can happen contingently, which means randomly. That is, according to anything that we can see or anything that we can measure, there doesn't seem to be any reason for it. It's we would say it happened randomly. Well, even those random events, God is in control. So again, there's a lot of verses that are in the confession you can look up, but hopefully as a Christian, you've learned to affirm God is in control. When is he in control? All the time. Of how many things is he in charge? Is he in control of? He's in control of all things. So this paragraph is helping us to sort of think through that piece by piece and saying, okay, well, what does it mean that he's in charge all the time, that he's always in control? Paragraph 3, God in his ordinary providence makes use of means, yet he is free to work without, above, and against those means at his pleasure. So what's going on here? The first part, God in his ordinary providence. Now, again, providence means God's way of working in the world. Ordinary providence means the way things normally happen. Okay, so we don't normally experience day to day the kind of miracles that we read about in the scriptures. Now, we could say everything that's happened in my life, if it snows today, is the snow a work of God? Yes, it is. But does it? But it's not. And just in the same way that a miracle is the work of God, right? So, really, we say, well, what's the difference between? Well, frequency. Snows happen more predictably, regularly. We can observe something of those second and third causes. I can say, oh, it snowed because of these atmospheric conditions or whatever. So I can see the causation is there. I can look at it and say this happened because of this, because I can trace that chain back. Whereas a miracle, it's like, I didn't see that coming. It happened and I don't observe. God kind of sets aside those second causes. And that's the point of this paragraph, is to say God ordinarily, in his ordinary providence, he makes use of means. He doesn't just decree the window will just break suddenly someday without in a miraculous kind of way, that he decrees a chain of causation, that he uses means to lead the window to be broken or whatever. So, for example, ordinarily, if you're healed from a sickness, it's God using means. If anybody gets better of any sickness ever, if you had COVID and you got better from COVID, that was God healing you, but he probably healed you through his ordinary providence. But in other words, he made use of means. There was medicine that you took or steps that you took to help to get better, right? So that's God's ordinary providence. But God is free to work without those means, beyond those means. He's free to set them aside and to do something in a miraculous or a more direct sort of way. Okay, so that's just a way of affirming God's freedom. God is not bound to use certain means to achieve something. God can't say, well, I'd really like to heal that sickness, but no medicine has been invented to heal it yet. Or all the doctors say that there's nothing they can do. There's no ordinary way the body could heal itself or that the doctors could help the body to heal. God is not bound. He is free to heal without any means. Paragraph 4. The almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God so far manifest themselves in his providence. So it says, God's providence shows his power, his wisdom, and his goodness, so that his determinate counsel extends itself even to the first fall, and all other sinful actions both of angels and men. So he's the confession is helping us again follow through on this biblical affirmation that God is in control, that God is sovereign over all things, and it's helping us follow it to its logical conclusion, right? It's warning us against carving out some exception clauses that would say something like this: well, yes, but anytime someone does something sinful, God is not in charge. And to be honest, there's many Christians who have struggled to accept this, right? They say, this time this person sinned against me in a very grievous way, or this person abused me or whatever. I can't believe that God was in charge of that. I can't believe that God would allow such a thing to happen. And the answer to that, of course, is to say the alternative is actually far worse. The idea that there would be some times in your life when God was out of control, that would be what God was not in control of your life, he's not in control of the world. That would actually be a far more frightening proposition than the idea that God was in control and he allows certain things for certain reasons, right? So God's counsel extends even to the first fall, meaning the fall of our first parents, Adam and Eve. Was God in charge then and in control? Yes, he was. And all other sinful actions, both of angels and men. Okay, so we might say, well, that's just God permitting those things to happen. He permits them to happen. We might even be comfortable with that, but the confession wants to push us farther. It says, and that not by a bare permission. It's not just God turning a blind eye or stepping away or saying, okay, I'm not going to directly stop them from doing that sinful action. It says, which also, meaning those sinful actions, he most wisely and powerfully binds. and otherwise orders and governs in a manifold dispensation to his most holy ends. Now, that word binds is important. He says he wisely and powerfully binds those sinful actions, meaning any sinful action, if we look at it on the surface, it appears to be a rebellion against God. Whether it's an angel sinning or a man sinning, we look at it and we say, sin detected. This is a person who is deliberately acting contrary to the will of God. But this word binds is important. It says, even when this person is doing their very hardest to rebel against God, they are still bound, and they are still unwilling slaves, and they are achieving God's purposes. They're not really breaking God's plans. They are, in an unwilling way, they are actually achieving God's plans. And that's a demonstration of God's power, his wisdom, and his goodness, that even those enemies that are trying to rebel against him can't do anything except to accomplish his will. You think of the motivations of the people that took the Son of God to a cross and murdered him. What was their intention? Their intention was a sinful thing, to prevent Jesus from being the Christ. And in fact, they only achieved the purposes of God through their sinful actions. Okay, so he says, and he binds them and otherwise orders and governs in a manifold or very complex dispensation so a very complex way. He's guiding even these actions to his most holy ends. God's up to something holy. So look back over your life at the times where you're most tempted to believe where God was out of control, or the history of the world, things happen in the world today. What things make you doubt that God would be in control? God's always up to something holy. He's bringing about his holy purposes through these very horrifying, sometimes, instruments. Yet so right there though, he has to say, let's hold on here. Yet so, as the sinfulness of those actions proceeds only from the creatures and not from God. Okay, so he said action, there's something going on here, sin detected. This thing is happening in the world. Okay, God is at work in this sinful thing, and the creatures are the ones committing the sin. So we use the language differently. We don't say God is committing the sinful action. We say God is overseeing, or he's administering what's happening in the sinful action. But the creatures committing sin, because we're trying to identify where the sin comes in. It is not sinful in God to allow these things to happen or to include these things in his plan, but it is sinful for the creature to willfully break the law of God. So it says there's sinfulness, the sinfulness of this action, that is all chalked up to the creature and not to God, who, being most holy and righteous, neither is nor can be the author or approver of sin. It is not possible for God to be guilty of sin. Okay, paragraph 5. The most wise, righteous, and gracious God does oftentimes leave for a season his own children. Now, what paragraph 5 is about is trying to answer the question, well, if God's in charge of everything, why on earth would unpleasant, bad things happen to God's people? Why would God's people even be left to times of temptation? Why would God's people fall into sin? Why would that be part of his plan? Okay, so he's saying the most wise, righteous, and gracious God does oftentimes leave for a season, he leaves his own children to manifold temptations, to all kinds of temptations and the corruptions of their own hearts. So it is part of God's plan to expose us to ongoing temptation and leave us almost helpless before the corruptions of our own hearts. Why? He gives some reasons. Now, he's just given the authors here are just giving us several examples of reasons. It's not trying to give us these are all the reasons that it could possibly be. He says, here's some examples. He might do this in your life to chastise them for their former sins, okay, as a discipline for sins we've committed in the past. Or to discover unto them the hidden strength of corruption and deceitfulness of their hearts. So in other words, to cause you to discover how strong corruption and deceit still reigns in your heart. As a Christian, sometimes we feel like I'm not the sinner I used to be. I'm not all that bad anymore. But God allows us to go through seasons where He leaves us, in a sense of He allows us to discover the great, through temptation, through our corruption of our hearts, He allows us to discover just how strong sin still lives in us. That they may be humbled, He says, and to raise them to a more close and constant dependence for their support upon Himself. So God allows you to go through those things in part so that you recognize how deep your need is of Him, and to cause you to more fully cast yourself in faith upon Christ, and to make them more watchful against all future occasions of sin. So you're not being strict enough in your watch against temptation. Well, God just might let you stumble real hard, and that may teach you for the rest of your life to keep a stronger guard against temptation. And then He says, and for other just and holy ends. But remember, God is always up to something holy in your life. So that whatsoever, last sentence of paragraph 5, whatsoever befalls any of His elect, any of His people that He's chosen, is by His appointment, for His glory and their good. It's always for His glory and for our good. Anything He brings into our lives is for our good. Paragraph 6. Now, what about unbelievers and God's His providential work in their lives? Paragraph 6. As for those wicked and ungodly men, whom God, as the righteous judge, for former sin does blind and harden. So this paragraph is talking about those who rightfully, now they were sinners just like us, or we should say we were sinners just like them. Were it not for God's grace, there would be no difference between us and them. But God, justly, righteously, He says, as the righteous judge, He causes He punishes them for their sins by blinding them and hardening them to His light. So they're blinded, they're hardened. From them, He not only withholds His grace, whereby they might have been enlightened in their understanding and wrought upon their hearts. So what He says is, people that in the end are not saved, are they not saved because it was too hard for God to save them? They were a tough cookie. They were a hard one to crack. God just wasn't able to save that person. No, it says He not only withholds His grace could have enlightened their understanding and worked in their hearts, could have done that, but God justly, righteously blinded and hardened them, kept back His grace that He could have given. The same grace that He gave to you that made the difference in you, He withheld from them. Not only that, it says, sometimes also withdraws the gifts which they had. So there's not a person alive on earth today, there's not a sinner alive on earth today that is not living on God's gifts, okay? We tend to think of God's gifts as some kind of special added quality to my life, or some special blessing that comes along in my life. You've got to remember, everything that we have is a gift. It all comes from God. He's the giver of all good things. So anything you've got in your life that's a positive thing, starting from life itself, is God's gift. It's His blessing to you. It's His grace to you. It says, so sometimes God withdraws those gifts. He takes some of those gifts away from sinners as a punishment for their sin, and exposes them to such objects as their corruption makes occasion of sin. This is an important wording here. It says that the things that God exposes sinners to that seems to lead them deeper into sin are not sinful in and of themselves, but because of the corruption of our hearts, we turn God's good gifts into occasions for sin, right? Sinners find sin in good things. God provides good things for us, and we turn them into sin. It's like little boys. You can tell them you're not going to let them play with toy guns or something like that. But little boys, once they know that something called a gun exists, they will turn anything, anywhere in the world into a toy gun. They get a stick, they're going to turn it into a toy gun. That's the way we as sinners are. We can, you put a sinner like us in a house full of God's blessings, and we will find sin in it. We will find ways to turn those things into the occasion of sin. And withal, it says, in other words, along with that, he gives them over to their own lusts, the temptations of the world, and the power of Satan. These are three great enemies, or the three great destructive forces in a sinner's life. Their own lusts, the world's temptation, and the power of Satan. So the enemy is people around me. There's an unseen spiritual enemy, and there's an enemy within. And God gives us over to those things. He gives these, I shouldn't say us as Christians, he gives the sinful world, he gives them over to these destructive enemies that they have chosen, whereby it comes to pass, or it happens, that they harden themselves under those means which God uses for the softening of others. Okay, so the same kind of thing that happens to a Christian and causes them to draw closer to God, the same thing happens to an unbeliever and pushes them further away from God. It hardens their heart. So God uses his providence in all kinds of amazing ways to achieve his ends. His good providences in a Christian's life, even his hard providence, difficult providences, the hard things that he sends our way, he can use for his good ends. Last paragraph, just one short sentence. Paragraph 7, as the providence of God does in general reach to all creatures, so after a more special manner it takes care of his church and disposes of all things to the good thereof. So we said very clearly, God's providence extends to all creatures. Everything that's happening in the universe is the providence of God. Everything that happens to you, learn to say, this is a providence of God. Whether it's an easy and a comfortable providence or a difficult providence, all things are sent to you by the providence of God. But it also says, after a more special manner, it takes care of his church and disposes of all things to the good thereof. So, in other words, God's providence, what's God doing in the world? It's not that we can just say, everything that happens in the world, God's doing it. We don't really know anything more than that. We don't understand what God's purposes are. We don't understand what's happening. This chapter ends by saying, we do know something more about it. We know that God is specifically, or in a more special way, he has a special providence by which he cares for his church. He takes care of his church, it says, after a more special manner. So God is doing something special, not just ordinary. It's not just an ordinary manner of caring for the church. He has a special care for the church, and he's doing special things in the church. And it says it disposes all things to the good thereof. So he's watching over the church for our good. As it said above in chapter 4, all things are for his glory and for the good of his people. Amen. So that is chapter 5 about divine providence, the providence of